Good morning, my dear students. How are you today? Today we are going to study our novel, Chapter 3, My Mother Dies. In our last chapter, we knew that the Murdstones sent David to a school in London called Salem School. And when he arrived there, he found that the school was deserted, as there was no one inside the school because it was a holiday, and he sent him during the holiday as a punishment. David was afraid of Mr. Creakle. Mr. Creakle was the manager of the school because he had a stick and he used to beat the boys hard. His life, or David's life at the school, was very bad. It was a miserable life. But the only two things, or the only thing that made David happy there was his only two friends, Tommy Traddles and James Steve Fox. Today you are going to know some new characters. We have Mr. Quinion, and Mr. Quinion was the manager of the warehouse in London, and the warehouse is a place where David would work after stopping going to school. We have also Mr. Micawber. Mr. Micawber was the owner of the house where David lived in London when he started work at the warehouse. And we have also Mrs. Micawber, and she was his wife. David would receive some bad news on his birthday, as Mrs. Creakle, Mr. Creakle's wife, would tell him that his mother was very ill and she died. After that, David would go to attend her funeral. When he arrived home, he found that Mr. Murdstone very sad, or seemed very sad, but he didn't speak to David. And Miss Murdstone showed no interest in David. After some days, the Murdstones asked Biggity to leave the house, as they didn't want a servant. She decided to go back to Yarmouth, and she took David with her to stay for some days in Yarmouth with her family. When they arrived there, David discovered, or he found, that Emily had changed, as she was taller and prettier, and she didn't want to play with David or spend her time with him. When David returned home to the Murdstones, they decided not to send him to school after his mother's death, as the school was too expensive, and they arranged for David to start work. They would send him to the warehouse, as we said before, the warehouse, and Mr. Quinion, the manager of the warehouse, and his new job was to wash bottles which would be filled with wine, or to pack the filled bottles in cases. There in this warehouse, David met Mr. Micawber, and Mr. Micawber was the owner of the house where David lived, as he worked in the warehouse and went and lived in or with Mr. Micawber. Mr. Micawber was a bad person. He used to take money from people and he couldn't pay the money back. So they sent Mr. Micawber to prison. After that, we would know that David decided to look for his father's aunt, Miss Betsy Trotwood, to ask her to help him, as he wanted to make a better life for himself and not to work as a boy in a warehouse. He decided to look for her with the help of the money he had been given from uh, Bigotee. And of course, he used or he decided to use the money to go to Dover by coach in order to look for his father's aunt. Now let's see the questions of chapter 3. Question number 1. What news did David receive on his birthday? Mrs. Creakle told him that his mother was very ill and she died. Number 2. How did the Murdstones react to David's presence? Mr. Murdstone seemed very sad, but he didn't speak to David. Miss Murdstone showed no interest in David. Number 3. Why did Bigotee leave the house and go to live with her brother in Yarmouth? Because the Murdstones asked her to leave the house as they didn't want a servant. Number 4. Emily had changed. Discuss. Emily was taller and prettier, and she didn't want to play with David or spend her time with him. Number 5. Why did Mr. Murdstone decide not to send David to school after his mother's death? Because the school was too expensive, so they arranged for David to start work. Number 6. What was David's new job? David's new job was to wash bottles which would be filled with wine or to pack the filled bottles in cases. Number 7. Who was Mr. Micawber? Mr. Micawber was the owner of the house where David lived. Why was Mr. Micawber sent to prison? He was sent to prison because he owed a lot of money to a lot of people and couldn't pay the money back. What did David decide to do in order to make a better life for himself? He decided to find his father's aunt, Miss Betsy Trotwood, and ask her to help him. Number 10. What did David decide to do with the money which Bigotee gave him? He decided to use the money to go to Dover by coach in order to look for his aunt's or his father's aunt. Let's see comments. We all have to accept that our loved ones can die at any moment. These words were said by Mrs. Creakle to David when she wanted to tell him that his mother was ill and she died. I will love you just as much, my dear. When I am married, I'll be able to come and see you in the court any time. These words were said by Bigotee to David when she decided to marry Mr. Parks. I hope my mistake will be a warning to young people like you. Remember, if a man earns £20 a year and spends £19, the result is happiness. These words were said by Mr. Micawber to David when Mr. Micawber was in prison because of his debts. Thank you for listening and see you next time.